In my 40 years on the bench, I've learned that respect is not something you demand. It's something you demonstrate. I've had defendants shout at me, argue with me, challenge my rulings, and walk out of my courtroom angry. I've seen frustration, fear, grief, and defiance in every possible combination. But every now and then, a case comes along that tests something different. Not your patience with rage, but your patience with pure, naked contempt. This young man didn't yell at me. He didn't argue. He simply rolled his eyes over and over as if every word I spoke was beneath him. And I want to tell you about the lesson I taught him that day, quietly, firmly, and without raising my voice once. Section 2. Setting the scene. When this case landed on my desk, it looked, on its surface, like a routine matter. The defendant was a 22-year-old man named Marcus Webb. The charges were 3 unpaid traffic violations: failure to stop at a red light, operating a vehicle with an expired registration, and driving without proof of insurance. Total fines, $480. He'd ignored 2 prior notices and had only appeared in my courtroom because a warrant had been issued for his failure to respond. I reviewed his file that morning before court. No prior criminal record, no history of serious infractions. Young man recently out of college, working his first real job. From a distance, this looked like someone who had simply gotten careless, let things pile up, ignored the paperwork, and found himself facing consequences he hadn't anticipated. I've seen that story hundreds of times. Normally, it resolves itself quickly. The person comes in, they're apologetic, we talk about a payment plan or community service, and they leave with a lesson learned and a manageable path forward. But there was a note in the file from my clerk. During his check-in that morning, Marcus had been, in her words, visibly impatient and somewhat dismissive with court staff. She'd noted it because it was noticeable enough to stand out. I put the file down. I've been doing this long enough to know that how a person treats the staff in the hallway before court is often a preview of who you're going to meet at the bench. I made a mental note, and I walked out to take my seat. Let me walk you through the background of these violations because the charges themselves matter, not just as legal infractions, but as a pattern of decision-making that told me something important about Marcus's approach to accountability. The first violation, running a red light, had been captured on a traffic camera at a busy intersection in the middle of the day, not a late-night lapse in judgment. A clear, unambiguous decision to drive through a red light at an intersection where other vehicles were present. When I reviewed the camera image, the light was solidly red. There was no reasonable interpretation otherwise. The second violation, expired registration, meant that Marcus had been driving a vehicle that hadn't been legally registered for 4 months before the stop. That's not something that sneaks up on you. You receive notices. You know your registration date. Letting it lapse for 4 months while continuing to drive is a choice. The third, no proof of insurance, compounded the concern. Now, I always give people the benefit of the doubt on that one. Sometimes you have insurance, you simply don't have the card in the vehicle. I was prepared to hear that explanation. What I was not prepared for, what I genuinely did not expect from the moment Marcus Webb walked through the door of my courtroom, was his demeanor. He walked in with his hands in his pockets, chin slightly raised. The kind of posture that communicates, before a single word is spoken, that a person considers this situation an inconvenience rather than a legal proceeding. He glanced around the room with an expression that I can only describe as mild boredom. He sat down, and when his name was called and he approached the bench, he didn't look at me directly. He looked slightly past me, at the wall, at the ceiling, like a person waiting for a bus that's running late. I introduced myself, welcomed him, and began asking my preliminary questions. Standard, respectful, the same way I open every case. And that's when he rolled his eyes for the first time. I want to be precise about this. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't a momentary flicker of frustration. It was a full, slow, deliberate eye roll, the kind that's designed to be seen, the kind that says, without words, I cannot believe I have to be here for this. I took a breath. I kept my voice exactly where it was, and I continued. Section 4, Escalation and Evidence. As I continued presenting the facts of his case, the pattern repeated itself, and with each repetition, it became clearer that this wasn't impatience. This was attitude, deliberate, practiced attitude. I asked Marcus about the red light violation. I said, "Mr. Webb, the camera image shows your vehicle entering the intersection on a red signal. Can you tell me what happened?" He shrugged. "I didn't really notice it." I said, "You didn't notice the light?" He said, "It was quick. I thought it was still yellow." I showed him the timestamp on the camera image. The light had been red for a full 2 seconds before his vehicle entered the intersection. I said, "Mr. Webb, the record shows the signal had been red for 2 seconds at the moment your vehicle crossed the line. Does that change your recollection?" He shrugged again. I moved to the registration. I asked how long he had known it was expired. He said, "A while." I said, "Can you be more specific?" He exhaled loudly and said, "Like a couple months maybe." And that's when the second eye roll came. I had asked a reasonable, direct question, and he responded by exhaling at me and rolling his eyes at the ceiling. I felt something rise in me. I want to be honest about that. Not anger. I've been on this bench too long to let anger drive my decisions, but a deep, measured disappointment. Because what I was watching wasn't a young man who was nervous or confused or frustrated with himself for letting things get to this point. What I was watching was a young man who genuinely did not believe that this moment, or these proceedings, or the person sitting across from him, deserved his basic respect. And that to me was the real issue. Not the $480, not the 3 violations. The real issue was sitting right there in that posture, in those eye rolls, in those exhales. I composed myself. I looked at him steadily, and I decided that before we got to the fines, we were going to have a conversation. By the time footage of this hearing made its way onto various platforms, I was told that the clip, specifically the moment when I addressed his eye rolling directly, had been watched and shared hundreds of thousands of times. My staff mentioned it to me, and there were comments from people across the country. What struck me about the response was its consistency. People weren't just reacting to Marcus, they were reacting to something they recognized. Parents saying they saw their own teenagers in him. Young people saying they'd been guilty of the same thing and were embarrassed watching it back. Professionals saying they'd sat across from someone with that exact energy in a workplace or a meeting. It resonated because it's not an uncommon thing. This particular brand of disrespect, the passive kind, the eye-rolling kind, the "I'm too cool to take this seriously" kind, is something a lot of people have encountered and often felt powerless in the face of. But let me tell you what I always say when people ask me about cases going viral. My answer never changes. When I'm sitting on that bench, I am not thinking about cameras. I am not thinking about who is watching or what the reaction will be. I am thinking about the person in front of me and what they need to hear. That is my responsibility. That is the only thing that guides me. Whether the clip gets 100,000 views or none at all, what I said to Marcus Webb that day was exactly what I would have said in an empty room, because it needed to be said, and because he needed to hear it. I want to take you inside that courtroom now, because this is where the story really lives. After that second eye roll, I set down the papers I was holding, gently, deliberately. I looked at Marcus for a long moment. He was looking at the edge of my bench. I said, "Mr. Webb." He looked up. "Barely." I said, "I'd like to pause the proceedings for a moment, not because anything unusual has happened legally, but because I want to talk to you about something, and I want you to actually hear me." He blinked. He hadn't expected that. I said, "In the time since you walked up to this bench, you've rolled your eyes twice and exhaled as though answering my questions is an enormous imposition. I want to ask you something sincerely. Do you understand where you are right now?" He said, "Yeah, court." I nodded slowly. "That's right, court. And the person asking you these questions is a judge. And the questions I'm asking you are not designed to embarrass you or to waste your time. They're part of a legal process that exists to treat you fairly. Do you understand that?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked down. I continued. "I've been doing this job for 40 years, Mr. Webb. I've sat across from people who were terrified, people who were grieving, people who had been through circumstances I wouldn't wish on anyone. And I have sat across from people who treated this courtroom the way you're treating it right now, like it's beneath them. Like the whole thing is a minor irritation between more important things." I paused. "Let that sit. I want you to look at me for a moment." He raised his eyes, and for the first time since he'd walked through that door, he was actually looking at me. I said, "You're 22 years old. You've got your whole life in front of you, and the habits you build right now how you carry yourself, how you treat people who have authority over a situation, how you respond when you're held accountable, those habits follow you. They follow you into jobs, into relationships, into every room you walk into for the rest of your life. I let that settle for a moment. Then I said, "Now, I'd like to go back to your case, and I'd like to do it with the understanding that this is a conversation between two people who respect each other. Can you do that?" He was quiet. But something had shifted. The chin came down slightly. The hands came out of their tense fold. He said quietly, "Yes, sir." That, "sir," that small word, told me we'd turned a corner. We went back through the violations. This time his answers were different. Still not effusive, still a young man who was clearly uncomfortable but present, engaged. He told me about the insurance, and yes, he did have it. He simply hadn't transferred his card to the new vehicle yet. I appreciated the honesty. I told him so. I asked him about the registration. He admitted he'd been putting it off because of the cost. He was paying off student loans and trying to build up savings at his first job. He said it plainly this time, without the shrug, without the exhale, just honestly. I said, "Mr. Webb, that's a real pressure. I understand that. And that's exactly the kind of information I need to hear, because it helps me understand your situation and respond fairly. That's all I've ever asked anyone who stands in front of me. Be honest, and I'll do my best to be fair." He nodded. I said, "I want to ask you something else, and I want you to think about it before you answer. When you walked in here this morning, the way you were carrying yourself, the responses, where was that coming from? What were you feeling?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I guess I felt like this was going to be a waste of time, like I'd come in and just get told to pay a bunch of fines and leave." I said, "So you'd already decided what this was going to be before it happened?" He thought about that. He said, "Yeah, I guess so." I nodded. "That's a very honest answer, and I appreciate it. But I want you to think about how that decision, the one you made before you even walked through that door, affected how you showed up, and how showing up that way affected how you were received. That's a cycle, Mr. Webb, and you're young enough to break it." I looked at him for a long moment. He was no longer bored. He was listening. I've been on this bench long enough to know that the most important sentencing isn't always the financial one. Sometimes the most important thing I can give a defendant is a clear mirror, a moment where they see themselves honestly and understand that what they're seeing needs to change. I looked at Marcus Webb and I said, "Mr. Webb, I want you to understand something before I address the fines." I paused. Disrespect is a habit, and like most habits, the person who has it often doesn't see it clearly. They think they're just being real, just being themselves, just not performing enthusiasm they don't feel. But what I saw when you walked in here today wasn't authenticity, it was armor. And the problem with that armor is that it keeps people from reaching you, and eventually it keeps opportunity from reaching you too. I paused again. I'm not angry with you. I want to be clear about that. What I am is invested in what happens to you after you walk out of this courtroom, because that's what this job is to me. Not collecting fines, not keeping score. It's trying to make sure that every person who stands in front of me leaves a little more equipped to navigate their life well. I leaned forward. Here is what I'm ordering. The red light violation stands $85. That decision had consequences for road safety, and the fine reflects that. The expired registration, I'm reducing the fine to $50 given your financial situation, but I want you to leave here today and take care of it within 30 days. I'll need proof of compliance filed with this court. The insurance violation, since you do carry insurance and simply lack the documentation, I'm dismissing that charge entirely. I continued. In addition, I'm ordering you to complete 15 hours of community service. I'm not doing this to add burden to your schedule. I'm doing this because I want you to spend some time, real time, being of service to other people. And I want you to pay attention to how that feels, because I think you might be surprised. I said, "Finally, and I mean this genuinely, I want you to reflect on today. Not the fines, not the courtroom, the conversation we had. Because 20 years from now, if you carry yourself with the grace and presence that this moment asked of you, you'll look back on this day as one that mattered. I truly believe that." I looked at him steadily. "You had choices today. You started by making poor ones. You finished by making better ones. That's growth, Mr. Webb. Don't stop doing that. After I adjourned that case, something happened that doesn't always happen. And when it does, it stays with me. Marcus didn't leave immediately. He stood near the side of the room while the next case was called, and when there was a natural pause and the courtroom was briefly less crowded, he caught my eye. He gave me a single quiet nod. That was it. No words, just a nod. I'll tell you what that meant to me. It meant he heard it. Not just the ruling, the conversation. Something had landed, and whether it changes him for a week or changes him for a lifetime, I can't know. But in that moment, something reached him. And that's all any of us can ask. I spoke with my clerk afterward. I told her what I always tell her after a case that goes beneath the surface. This job isn't about the law alone. The law is the framework. But inside that framework, there are human beings, and the most important thing we can do is see them clearly and speak to them honestly. She asked me if his eye rolls had bothered me. I told her the truth. They bothered me the way it bothers me to see any young person waste their own potential. Not because my feelings were hurt. I'm a judge, my feelings aren't the point. But because I could see, clearly, a young man who had developed a reflex that was going to cost him. And the saddest part about that kind of reflex is that the person who has it usually doesn't see it costing them. They just slowly find that doors aren't opening, that people aren't warming to them, that rooms don't receive them the way they expected, and they don't always connect it back to this. I hope Marcus connected it back. I believe he started to right there in that courtroom. Let me tell you what I hope people take from this case, because it matters beyond Marcus and beyond my courtroom. We live in a time when a certain kind of detachment has become fashionable. The eye roll, the shrug, the performance of being unbothered, these have become signals of coolness, of sophistication, of not being naive enough to actually care about the ordinary proceedings of ordinary life. Social media is full of that energy. The person who's too cool to be impressed, too savvy to be earnest, too self-aware to actually engage. And I want to say this as gently and directly as I know how. That posture is a trap, because life, real life, not the curated version, rewards presence. It rewards the person who walks into the room ready to engage, ready to listen, ready to be honest, even when it's uncomfortable. Those people get further. They build better relationships. They earn more trust. They become people that others want to help. Respect isn't weakness. Engagement isn't naivety. Showing up with your whole self, ready to be accountable, that's strength. That's what I've seen in the best people who have ever stood before me. After 40 years on this bench, I still believe that every person who walks through that door has the capacity to be better than their worst moment. Marcus Webb proved that in real time in front of everyone on a Tuesday morning in Providence. That's what justice looks like when it works. Not just a ruling, a conversation, a shift, a young man walking out with a little more self-awareness than he walked in with. That's what I still show up for every single day.